The following is a Barrett Sports Media production. There are two sides to the broadcast industry: content creators and moneymakers. This podcast is for that second group: sellers, buyers, managers, anyone with an interest in business. You're all welcome here. This is Seller to Seller. Now, here's your host, Jeff Cabes.
John Goforth had a great run in radio and sports talk and sales and play-by-play. He started in sales for Clear Channel 19 years ago at a small cluster in Springfield, Illinois. I think there's a cartoon in Springfield. He then moved on to selling St. Louis Cardinals baseball at legendary Mighty MOX in St. Louis. He helped launch sales at the thriving 101 ESPN and the Rams radio network, which you did not know. I am a Los Angeles Rams fan and a Los Angeles native. He then went on to Chicago to be the LSM at CBS Radio before Intercom merged it, focusing on 670 The Score and 93 XRT, a rocker, until 2016. John went and leaped into podcasts as the VP of sales for the Midwest, followed by leading sales at How Stuff Works, until they sold that company to iHeart in 2018. So John pivots, and he becomes iHeart's SVP, Senior VP of Podcast Revenue Strategy. Boy, how that looks different 4 years later. He is one of the first subs to the platform Magellan AI, and he liked it so much he left iHeart in 2019 to become the CRO, providing podcast advertising analytics to hundreds of buyers and sellers of podcast advertising. Tell me about this move you made from radio to podcasting in about 2016. I looked it up, John. Podcast revenue 6 years ago was like $120 million business. I want to hear how you explain that to the people that you know best.
I do think it was the one thing. It wasn't that long ago, and the one thing that was obvious, although podcasts weren't in their prime, some would argue they still aren't, but are moving in that direction. The one thing that was obvious is that on-demand media was here and here to stay, and with the proliferation of technology, wasn't going anywhere. Meanwhile, I'm working in local radio sales, and every year, I mean, this isn't me talking down local radio sales. This is just the cold hard facts. Every year, our pie was shrinking. And, I was based in Chicago, and, you look at it year after year, and it's like, okay, another 5% this year, the following year, another 5%, just retraction of the market. And I've worked in radio since my first day, out of college, but I realized that the writing was sort of on the wall, not that it was ending, but that it needed to morph and it needed to change. It needed to evolve. What happened was I was driving around going to meet my reps at various places across the Chicagoland area. And every time I'd find myself listening to podcasts on the way, rather than my own stations or competitive stations. Uh-huh. And so when I was asking myself, how can I get in front of this transformation that's happening in my industry? Like, oh, wait, isn't the answer what I'm listening to every day? And wow. So I had to find a company that was well enough established that they would like some representation in the Midwest. That wound up being Midroll Media, and I made the jump.
When you look at what you did and see how it's worked out for you now, do you see some things, some characteristics of where you were at with your radio career that may or may not work for somebody listening to this right now who thinks, God, I'm like John, maybe I should think about this. I'm not like John, I'm going to stay where I am. What would those things be?
I actually think it's easier to make a transition like that today than it would have been back then, because there are just more opportunities out there. At Magellan AI, we work with all the predominant publishers, medium, large size, even small size publishers. And the most frequent question that I get is, do you know any good salespeople? Because they are desperate for good salespeople. It's funny, I think back to when I entered into radio, there's like, here's a small, it wasn't even a guarantee at the time. But basically in advance, and you're 100% commission, and mm-hmm. you owe the company money if you don't, close enough deals.
Right. They deduct it from you.
That kind of thing doesn't fly nowadays. Take that versus the way it is today. I think, well, I'm getting off the plot here. Your question was about, what allows someone to make that transition.
Yes.
Back then, back then, I think there was a big desire for people who were transitioning to have a digital background. People weren't thinking of podcasts as audio the same way they think as terrestrial radio as audio. And I think that's evolved since then. While they're certainly different channels, they are very, very similar to each other and take very similar skill sets. The one thing I would say, the one skill set that I've noticed has been important in media sales, if you're in podcasts, maybe more so than if you're just in terrestrial radio or kind of a more old guard media, is the ability to be able to explain what a podcast download is. What's a hosting service? How does that download translate to listens, or does it? How does the IAB view a download? What are the metrics by which they count? You need to be pretty sharp on that stuff. You can't just skip over those details on the podcast side.
All right, let me skip into this detail. You mentioned you think media sellers would make great podcast sellers. So if I'm selling for, you name the radio station, and I have a play-by-play contract, I'm going out to people who are going to benefit from that, who know that audience. They may listen themselves. Their activations could be at the store level. I'm going to create some promotion. I have air personalities that may do endorsements for that campaign on air. We're going to have tickets and suites and get you involved that way. You may get to meet a player. Do you understand that? There I go. I have a map, right?
Right.
So what about podcast sales? How does that go?
I don't know that the map's all that different. I mean, first, if you have access to everything that you just described, you probably also have podcasts. If you're a play-by-play for, the Milwaukee Brewers, I'm sure that station has a number of podcasts. Their Brewers Insider probably does a weekly show. They probably have a few others as well, just from, the talk people that are part of that cluster. So you've got podcast inventory. You're a podcast seller as it is.
Sure. Okay.
And so it's an extension. Whenever I was on that side, I was always trying to think of 360-degree initiatives. If I want to sell somebody, I didn't want to just sell them on airtime. I wanted to sell them everything that we had, because you get that that kind of crossover sample. So if I was trying to sell podcasts, I was somewhere that had podcasts, I would start there. If my goal was to move away from that company and move into a company that was more predominantly podcasts, mm-hmm. I would focus on honing the art of selling those podcasts where I currently am, so I could then prove that in numbers on my resume to the people I'm going to go interview with. Sales leaders love numbers.
If I'm out selling podcasts in my cluster, am I best off selling reach? Am I best off selling activation, that this podcast will carry your message and only your message, and we can move the needle in this area over this many listens or downloads or time? How do you suggest that should go?
The answer to that question is it depends. And I'm not trying to evade answering it, but the reality is that every cluster has its own unique set of circumstances. There are some clusters that have shows that are great. Some shows either podcast does better than the terrestrial feed, or even there is no terrestrial feed anymore and they've just got a great podcast. Mm-hmm. And, if a show has that kind of following, that kind of engagement, I'm leaning into host read ads and just telling them to embrace the medium as it's defined. If I have a lot more just kind of radio replay podcasts that perhaps, they get some listeners, but really, if we're gonna sell these things, we're gonna need to bundle these impressions together. It's not just the replay of the morning show. It's the replay of the morning show, the afternoon show, the weekend show, whatever the content is.
Right.
And in those cases, I'm layering in the podcast for reach and frequency. I'm hitting more people more often with that same message, as opposed to those kind of primary podcasts that I'm going to lean into the endorsement, the borrowed credibility of the host.
When we get into direct response advertising, and I know you've got experience with this, they have a way to track how things are working. We've all heard podcasts that may have like some fresh food company or dollar razors. I don't want to use a lot of names, but I think we get who we're talking about. And so they're almost tracked, and they'll give you use the Jeff Caves discount and you'll get 20% off, and then they're tracking you. So what's your thoughts on the direct response category? Because, salespeople get a little nervous all of a sudden when they're going to be judged, right?
Yeah, there's a couple important distinctions. One, you don't have to be nervous about direct response if it's involving podcasts. That's how this medium grew up. You mentioned it was $120 million in 2016. My guess is that 90% of that was direct response, if not higher. Only recently, last 12, 18 months, have we started to see real brand awareness dollars. You can rest on the shoulders of those that came before you that it worked, and it worked well. A lot of podcast advertisers that are direct response in nature use a unique URL or coupon code. Like you mentioned, here's the Jeff discount. Mm-hmm. And they track those conversions or a modeled version of those conversions to decide if the podcast was successful or not. And the reality is, if you've been selling AM radio for any amount of time, sports play-by-play, you've sat with your clients and you've talked about lean-in listening, active listening versus passive listening. Well, podcasts are that on steroids. It works really well. I remember when I would run direct response campaigns when I was in sports talk radio, I never had problems, like it worked well, as opposed to some of the music formats were a little bit more challenging, just to be frank. So, I think the other thing to keep in mind too, as technology progresses, marketers are getting more sophisticated with how they measure. So they're not all just using coupon codes, unique URLs. Now podcast attribution exists, the same way in which attribution exists in any other digital channel. That's where a listener is identified by their IP address. And then, you basically match that to an IP address of a conversion on the advertiser's website. So they bought the tchotchke, they bought the razor, whatever the thing is. Mm-hmm. And they go, okay, great. So John listened to that podcast and he bought it. They are getting more sophisticated, but the good news is all of the early and midterm returns on the performance are going swimmingly.
So in a lot of these markets that may be listening to this, they're going to be marked below market, 25. They're going to have podcasts in their building that may get 1,000 downloads a week, maybe 12,000 a month or less, or a lot less. And are there Mendoza lines where you think that, hey, watch out, what you're selling is results, because until a podcast gets to a certain number, you're not going to be able to supply that kind of direct response results?
I think there probably is a line. I don't know. I don't have an exact number for you. If a podcast on a weekly basis, gets less than 500 downloads, you're just dealing with a pool that is pretty sparse. Even if from a percentage perspective you kill it, they still only converted 2 deals or whatever. So there probably is a line. I think of any podcast of any size, given relative to the size of the marketplace, podcasts are national by nature. They're not geo-targeted, but local podcasts are inherently geo-targeted because 90+% of the people that care about the content are going to be in that area. And so, I'd play into that. I also think of, as long as they're above the Mendoza line, as it were, whatever that number is. I always thought of podcasts as a great entry point. If I'm a seller that's working with perhaps someone new to my cluster or new to advertising in general or new to audio, before I try to sell them on the $25,000 plan I'd like to sell them on, maybe we could start to, whet their appetite with some results just being part of the podcast. Because, there's a lower barrier to entry financially for them.
I do have some other questions for you, but it just, dawns on me, we should talk more about Magellan AI, exactly what you're providing as analytics to the buying community and to the seller community. Are you sort of taking on the role of Nielsen for radio stations, or what?
Well, listen, there are plenty of data and analytics companies out there and other channels that provide a lot of great things. And our sole focus right now is in the podcast space. And so we're not trying to replace anyone. We just are trying to kind of, blaze our own trail in the podcast space. We work with, as you said, folks on the buy side and folks on the sell side. The company started primarily working with publishers, sellers. I was actually, I was one of the first subscribers to Magellan. I think you mentioned earlier in the show when I was leading sales at a company called How Stuff Works. And I remember our CEO at the time was Connell Byrne, who's now CEO over at iHeart. And, I went to him and said, hey, we should subscribe to this. And he said, just tell me one thing. Will we make our money back? And I felt like I was sticking my neck out on the line a little bit. I'm like, yeah, I think we will. I was able to go back to him 8 days later and tell him we did. And the reason for that is more than other channels that I've experienced in my career, it is so much easier to sell an advertiser who's already engaged in the podcast ecosystem than someone who isn't. I always wanted to leave it. I wanted it to be someone else's job to convince them that podcasts were the right channel. I just wanted to find the people that had already embraced the channel and convince them that my content was good content to try. And that's what we offer at Magellan AI. Sellers use us to understand the marketplace. Who's spending, what genres are they accelerating in? Where are they pulling back? How much money are they spending? What does their competitive field look like? What does their industry look like? Folks on the buy side use the platform much more as a media planning and show discovery tool. So as all the listeners I'm sure know, the podcast world's pretty decentralized still. Let's just say that you wanted to target folks that love SEC football. Well, you can look at the sports genre. You can even look at the football genre and find a bunch of podcasts.
Right.
But how do I find those exact people? And that's where Magellan AI comes. On the sell side, we're helping you decide who to target and who to go after. On the buy side, it's like completing the buyer's journey.
Okay, John. So you've made this transition from everything from Camo X, which some people would never want to leave, right? For me growing up, that was like one of the ultimate jobs you could have in the country, up there with TOP in Washington D.C. selling radio there. You look back now and you say, okay, here I am, 6-7 years later, and I'm working at Magellan AI. I've already headed up iHeart's podcast revenue strategies. How did I get here? What did it take for me to learn? What do I not regret? What do I regret? Because I want somebody listening to this to think, if I want to do this, I need to do the following. And I know education is going to be near the top of your list.
It's number one on the list.
Okay.
So I got into the podcast space, and I asked a bunch of questions of someone I knew in the industry. And I took voracious notes, and I went on to then go talk to clients and explain to them the way I understood it to work from that partner in the industry. And I found out a few months later that everything that person had told me was wrong. But from that moment on, I realized, okay, it's my responsibility to understand this stuff so I can convey the value to others. And it's my responsibility to also tell them how it works, warts and all. And if they choose to invest, that's great. And so from then on, I became a student of the game. I subscribed to every periodical that I could, daily emails, weekly emails, still read Pod News religiously every day, and a number of others. But and then, going to the IAB's website and understanding what is the IAB V2, what does that mean in the podcast space? It reads like stereo instructions, but it's vitally important. It's vitally important to understand that when you tell someone, hey, the inventory I just sold you, that it got 1 million downloads, what's a download? What does that mean? And then how does it count as a download? Does it mean that they downloaded the whole file? No, not exactly. Most people think when they listen on their Apple Podcast player that they're streaming it because they hit play and it plays. Turns out that's a progressive download in the background. And so just understanding those levels of nuance allowed me to get a lot more dangerous as I'd go into agencies and brands and sing the praises of the podcast world. So that'd be number one on the list for me.
Yeah, and place to start for some would be at the IAB. Is that like the RAB, NAB of the podcast world or digital audio world?
The Interactive Advertising Bureau, so mostly everything digital. And I'm not saying they're the end all be all. But they are the lens through which most view the ecosystem today. So it's important just to know it. If you want to understand the players involved in the podcast world, we actually have a resource at our website, Magellan.ai, called the Podscape. Here are the publishers, here are the agencies, so on and so forth. Here are the platforms, etc. We did that for the podcast space. So you can go to Magellan.ai, download the Podscape, and it'll give you a sense of who all the players are. So that's another important. And then I mentioned Pod News earlier. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but they do a great job of not only providing data news on a daily basis and keeping you up to date with what's going on in the ecosystem, but also there's a lot of helpful articles on their website, podnews.net, I believe, about just how podcasts work, how downloads work, just kind of the basic 101 stuff that would be really helpful if you're kind of new to it.
Yeah. Do they have certifications yet, John? Like, in radio, there's certified markets, CRMs, and, there's certified sellers, and there's all these systems per se.
The IAB does sell certification in the podcast space. Most hosting platforms and publishers have, are a part of it. And there are also other great resources like there's a ad tech newsletter for podcasts specifically called Sounds Profitable, written by a guy named Brian Barletta, who knows his stuff backwards and forwards. Another great resource too.
Fantastic. John, great information. I hope that we've clarified some things and maybe even motivated some others to get off your ass and sell the podcast in your building, right?
Absolutely. You've got access to the inventory right in front of you. I think, as a seller, I'm sure it's like just one more thing that we have to sell, but the reality is there is an appetite for it. When I was selling terrestrial radio, you'd get a hold of an agency that, got added to your list and you didn't know anyone there, and you're trying your darndest to get in there and get a meeting. And it's like pulling teeth. They've heard from the radio people before. They don't want to hear it again. When you call somebody and say you're part of podcasts, boy, that the response is a lot different. And, they'd love a lunch and learn. They'd love to learn more. And then also, if I can ever be helpful to anybody, you're welcome to reach out to me as well. I'm John@Magellan.ai.
All right. Thanks to John Goforth for joining me here on Seller to Seller. You can find John, as he mentioned, on most social media. I found him on LinkedIn. And please review and subscribe to this pod. Pass it along. That's how we grow it. Email me, jeffcase54@gmail.com with interview requests. Check barrettsportsmedia.com for weekly sales columns and past pods. I will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to Seller to Seller with Jeff Caves. Each episode is available on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, the iHeart app, and most podcasting platforms. To stay in touch with Jeff, follow him on Twitter @JeffCaves and read his sales columns on barrettsportsmedia.com.